Good morning. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Chapter 2. If you remember from Chapter 1, our main character is Charlie Bucket, and he lives in a small, kind of rundown house with his grandma and grandpa, and grandma and grandpa, and mom and dad, and they are very poor. And they eat just ugh, bland, lame, gross food every day. But Charlie also lives in the city with the chocolate factory. And he has to smell that delicious, wonderful, fantastic chocolate all the time. Chapter 2. Mr. Willy Wonka's Factory. In the evenings, after he had finished his supper of watery cabbage soup, Charlie always went into the room of his four grandparents to listen to their stories. Let's see if I can pull this up for you so that you can maybe follow along a little bit. And then afterwards to say goodnight. Every one of these old people was over 90. They were as shriveled as prunes and as bony as skeletons. And throughout the day, until Charlie made his appearance, they lay huddled in their one bed, two at either end, with nightcaps on to keep their heads warm, dozing the time away with nothing to do. But as soon as they heard the door opening and heard Charlie's voice saying, "Good evening, Grandpa Joe, and Grandma Josephine, and Grandpa George, and Grandma Georgina," then all four of them would suddenly sit up, and their old wrinkly faces would light up with smiles of pleasure. And the talking would begin, for they loved this little boy. And he was the only bright thing in their lives, and his evening visits were something that they looked forward to all day long. Often Charlie's mother and father would come in as well and stand by the door, listening to the stories that the old people told. And thus, for perhaps half an hour every night, this room would become a happy place, and the whole family would forget that it was hungry and poor. One evening, when Charlie went in to see his grandparents, he said to them, "Is it really true that Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest in the world?" "True?" they cried, all four of them at once. "Of course it's true. Good heavens! Didn't you know that? It's about 50 times as big as any other." "And is Mr. Willy Wonka really the cleverest chocolate maker in the world?" "My dear boy," said Grandpa Joe, raising himself a little higher on his pillow, "Mr. Willy Wonka is the most amazing, the most fantastic, the most extraordinary chocolate maker the world has ever seen. I thought everybody knew that." "I knew he was famous, Grandpa Joe, and I knew he was very clever." Let's see here, let's find it for you. There it is. He was very clever. "Clever!" cried the old man. "He's more than that. He's a magician with chocolate. He can make anything he wants. Isn't that a fact, my dears?" The other three old people nodded their heads up slowly up and down, and said, "Absolutely true, just as true as can be." And Grandpa Joe said, "You mean to say I've never told you about Mr. Willy Wonka and his factory?" "Never," answered little Charlie. "Good heavens above! I don't know what's the matter with me." "Will you tell me now, Grandpa Joe, please?" "Certainly I will. Sit down beside me on the bed, my dear, and listen carefully." And here's a picture of Charlie sitting next to his grandparents. Grandpa Joe was the oldest of the four grandparents. He was 96 and a half, and that is just about as old as anyone can be. Like all extremely old people, he was delicate and weak, and throughout the day he spoke very little. But in the evenings, when Charlie, his beloved grandson, was in the room, he seemed in some marvelous way to grow quite young again. All his tiredness fell away from him, and he became as eager and excited as a young boy. "Oh, what a man he is, this Mr. Willy Wonka!" cried Grandpa Joe. "Did you know, for example, that he has himself invented more than 200 new kinds of candy bars, each with a different center, each far sweeter and creamier and more delicious than anything the other chocolate factories can make?" "Perfectly true," cried Grandma Josephine. "And he sends them to all the four corners of the earth. Isn't that so, Grandpa Joe?" "It is, my dear, it is. And to all the kings and presidents of the world as well." "But it isn't only candy bars that he makes. Oh, dear me, no. He has some really fantastic inventions up his sleeve. Mr. Willy Wonka has. Did you know he's invented a way of making chocolate ice cream so that it stays cold for hours and hours without being in the icebox? You can even leave it lying in the sun all morning on a hot day and it won't go runny." "But that's impossible," said Charlie, staring at his grandfather. "Of course it's impossible," cried Grandpa Joe. "It's completely absurd. But Mr. Willy Wonka has done it." "Quite right," the others agreed, nodding their heads. "Mr. Wonka has done it." "And then again," Grandpa Joe went on, speaking very slowly now, so that Charlie wouldn't miss a word, "Mr. Willy Wonka can make marshmallows that taste of violets, and rich caramels that can change color every 10 seconds as you suck them, and little feathery sweets that melt away deliciously the moment you put them between your lips. He can make chewing gum that never loses its taste, and candy balloons that you can blow up to enormous sizes before you pop them with a pin and gobble them up. And by a most secret method, he can make lovely bluebirds' eggs with black spots on them. And when you put one of these in your mouth, it gradually gets smaller and smaller until suddenly there is nothing left except a tiny little pink sugary baby bird sitting on the tip of your tongue." Grandpa Joe paused, ran to the point of his tongue slowly over his lips. "It makes my mouth water just thinking about it," he said. "Mine too," said little Charlie. "But please, go on." While they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, Charlie's mother and father, had come quietly into the room, and now both were standing just inside the door, listening. "Tell Charlie about that crazy Indian prince," said Grandma Josephine. "He'd like to hear that." "You mean Prince Pottencherry?" said Grandpa Joe, and he began chuckling with laughter. "Completely dotty," said Grandpa George. "But very rich," said Grandma Georgina. "What did he do?" asked Charlie eagerly. "Listen," said Grandpa Joe, "and I'll tell you." All right, so that is chapter 2. Let's take a look at this. All right, so at the very beginning, when we are being told what the grandparents are like, we get these similes, these comparisons. And it says they are as shriveled as prunes. Well, here's a picture of prunes. They're all shriveled up. And so we can imagine that their faces and their skin are all shriveled up. So there's just these tiny little grandparents with shriveled skin. And that they are also bony as skeletons. And so then we imagine here what a skeleton looks like. And we know that they are as bony as skeletons. So their bodies are just so tiny. It just, right? Okay. It also says that they spend most of the day dozing. Dozing, which means falling asleep and taking a nap. So they just basically lay in bed all day long and doze. Okay, in the copy that we're reading right now, you can't see the italics. The word is italics. But if we look in the book here, and I will try and show you, you can see things like, is it really true? I'm trying to do everything backwards here. There we go. Is it really true? True. Again, trying to do, there we go. True. And so italics here, my dear boy, is when we print the word slightly differently. Italics are when we have slanted words, and you can see that here with the word smaller, slanted, and different. It's just a little different, which means that we have to read it a little differently, because I could read it like this. Is it really true that Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest in the world? True, cried all four of them. Of course it's true. Good heavens, didn't you know that? It's about 50 times big as any. But when we get the italics, we get so much more of a rich, real discussion. Is it really true that Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest? True, cried all four of them. Of course it's true. Good heavens, didn't you know that? It's about 50 times as big as any other. So just like exclamation points can emphasize something, the italics create a way for us to read the word with more emphasis. So when you do get the text, always pay attention to little clues like that the text is being emphasized just a little bit. All right, eager is really excited. And so we see that they're eagerly talking about the story, especially at the end. What did he do? Said Charlie eagerly. So he's excited. He wants to know more. Eager. It's a good word, eager. I love that. It's a funny little gif there. An icebox is a word we don't use much anymore. Today we use the word refrigerator. But back in the, when was this? I'm getting my other book confused. I almost said 1930s. That's Mice and Men. I think this was in the 60s. Let's see here. Yeah, 1964. So back in the 60s, they didn't quite have refrigerators the way we have them today. Especially a poor family like this would probably not have the kind of money to buy an actual refrigerator. So what they had was an ice box where you literally took ice and put it in there, and the ice would keep everything cold. But here's what Willy Wonka has invented. Ice cream that doesn't need to be in the refrigerator because it never melts. It's pretty amazing. It's not real, but it's fun. It's imaginative. So, ice cream that doesn't need to be in the ice box, doesn't need to be in the refrigerator. That's pretty amazing invention. All right, the word absurd, which we got in here, absurd. Grandpa says that of course it's ridiculous to make ice cream that doesn't go in the ice box. He says it's completely absurd. Ridiculous, silly, makes no sense, strange. Of course it is absurd, but he did it. He did the impossible. He did the unthinkable. Mr. Willy Wonka could create amazing things. Okay, he creates bubble gum that you can blow up to enormous sizes, and you can see that's a very enormous bubble. Pretty amazing, actually. Okay, enormous means huge, gigantic, big. All right, and then as I mentioned, this is originally an English, as in British English, as in the United Kingdom, England English. And so they use the word dotty. Dotty is a word we don't really use here in the United States, but it means crazy. It's completely crazy. He's completely dotty. So, anyway, just means crazy, wild, bonkers. Okay, that is chapter 2. I hope you are enjoying the story so far. We will catch you again for chapter 3 later. Bye for now.